Welcome inside another edition of Land of 10 Live. Sam Raid and Chris Howard, looking forward to being with you for the next half hour. Plenty of stuff to get to, as always, here on Land of 10 Live. And Chris, the bigwigs made us promise an impartial Chris Howard breaking down Michigan's trip to the Final Four, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Listen, we definitely want more fan engagement for you guys, and I promise we will not be homers. It will not always be about Michigan. We will be inclusive and talk about every school, every program in the Big Ten.
So you mean we're going to cover Northwestern basketball today?
Probably not.
Maryland basketball today?
Probably not.
Okay, I see. The producers want that. No, you're not going to get any Maryland basketball today. Here's what you will get coming up on the program. Plenty of Michigan coverage, but before we get to that, though, spring practice kicking off, so we got some news and notes already from around the league with spring football underway, and as we look to some of the storylines we started discussing last week, we'll talk about who some of the names are that you'll need to know coming into this Big Ten football season. We will talk about Michigan's trip to the Final Four. We'd talk about your other teams, producers, if they were still playing, and the NIT doesn't count, much to the chagrin of the folks from a couple weeks ago where we debated seeds for the NIT, but I digress. Then some more news and notes from around the league in the Big Ten, couple position battles to get to, a couple off-the-field announcements to get to, and like Chris said, we will look forward to getting involved with you guys. If you want to join us, go to our Land of 10 Facebook page. You're there already. You're checking us out. If you want to interact with Chris, you want to interact with the rest of us here on Land of 10 Live, we got all that coming up for you and more over the course of the next 30 minutes. So let's get it started talking about Penn State football, which is kind of where we were for part of last show. We know, obviously, maybe the biggest name leaving the Big Ten this year was Saquon Barkley, and now the picture's starting to become a little bit clearer about who's going to replace Saquon in the backfield there in Happy Valley.
Well, yeah, I think when you're talking about Penn State, if you're talking about replacement of Saquon Barkley, obviously the first name that comes to mind is Miles Sanders, who is an outstanding running back, was a highly recruited kid coming out of high school, and Penn State got him to commit to the school. Obviously, there's another kid, Ricky Slade. Ricky Slade was one of the top all-purpose backs in the country coming out of high school, so it's obviously going to be hard to replace a Saquon Barkley. Again, he's a once-in-a-generation type of athlete, but they have the tools, they have the athletes to kind of make up for that. Obviously, though, the bulk of that will reside on the shoulders of Trace McSorley.
What is that like as a player when you either are part of a group of guys looking to fill the shoes from somebody that's a big name like Saquon Barkley leaving, or maybe even as a recruit when you know that there's a lineage now starting to develop? Again, there has been for years, decades at Penn State at the running back position, but what was your experience in those aspects?
Well, you know, you kind of have to look at it like, you know, you have to do it together. You have to really kind of gel as an offensive running back group. You have to really kind of come together and understand that probably one guy is not going to be able to replace a legend. Similar in my situation, we had to replace Tyrone Wheatley. We had to replace Tim Biakabatuka. So our group, we were a great group of running backs together. As a unit, we were better than as an individual. So we just kind of took it upon ourselves to just kind of get better as a group so that we can make up for the slack that we were losing when we lost guys like Wheatley and Tim Biakabatuka.
What about the notion of as a recruit? We've talked about this before. I think it's interesting. I don't know if we have a lot of time for it today, but it's fascinating to me how much or how little of college football in Michigan that you were familiar with when you decided to commit to Michigan. But what about the notion of coming in to replace a guy? You talked about Ricky Slade. Now, he could be perhaps the heir apparent to Saquon Barkley and all the great running backs at Penn State, Kurt Warner and Kijana Carter and all those guys too.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Ricky Slade, I mean, you got to be excited because, again, this is a guy that you probably followed through his entire career. This is probably a guy that you looked up to, and this is probably a guy that was one of the reasons why you decided to commit to Penn State, because you saw all the success that Saquon Barkley had. So if you're a guy like Ricky Slade, you see the opportunity, you know you're going to be somewhere in that 2 to 3 deep in the running back group. So for him, it's a great opportunity to get in, to learn, and really contribute, because he will contribute his first year.
Switching gears now to talk about Nebraska, and we've done a lot of that this offseason so far. Another one on the grad transfer carousel spinning its way toward Lincoln. Brandon Dawkins, a guy who considering getting involved there in the mix at Nebraska. First off, your thoughts on Brandon Dawkins and the impact he could have at Nebraska, and second of all, the notion of grad transfers. This is a relatively new thing, I feel like, in college football, getting that 5th year, the unencumbered transfer. Are you for it? Are you against it?
Well, I'm for it. Anytime that a player can find another place where he can go and excel, I'm always for that player seeking out more opportunity for himself so that he can continue his career. I think with Brandon Hawkins, I mean, he's transferring in from Arizona. Nebraska has a lot of young quarterbacks, so there's really no proven leader in that quarterback room. Obviously, they have Adrian Martinez, who was a highly recruited kid coming out of high school. There's a lot of onus being put on his shoulders as well. So if you're a guy like Brandon Hawkins, either going to Brandon Dawkins, I apologize. If you're going to Nebraska, that's a great opportunity for you. But we got to hold our horses a little bit. UCLA is also pushing for his service as well. So Scott Frost is actually going up against his old boss, Chip Kelly, for the services of this kid.
But what about the notion of, let's say that there was a situation where you were the heir apparent starting running back at the University of Michigan, and a kid who's got a 5th year of eligibility transfers in and is able to leapfrog over you in the depth chart. You had worked for your 4 years or 3 years or whatever had been leading up to that to find your place atop that depth chart. Now all of a sudden a guy comes in from outside who hadn't been to all the camps, hadn't run the stadium steps that you did, and he just jumps on top of you on the depth chart. What does that feel like?
Well, I mean, you have to look at it. The coach is always going to play the best player available, and if you've been there 2-3 years in the system and you've learned the system, you have to essentially look at yourself like you're a veteran. So even though grad transfers transfer into the program, they're not guaranteed that they're going to start. Michigan had a guy who transferred in a couple years ago from Stanford to Michigan. Everybody thought this guy was going to be an automatic plug-in at the cornerback position. He never saw the field. So even though a lot of schools are taking in grad transfers, it's a hit or miss situation for some of these kids. So it's not etched in stone that this kid is going to be a starter. So if you're a young quarterback at Nebraska, the playing field is level.
Appreciate Peter's comments so far on Facebook, but all he says is go Bucks. I mean, come on, man. You got anything more informative than that? Bring it to us and we'll respond to it. If you want to sound off on grad transfers or any of these kind of position battles and other things we're talking about as we get set with spring practice, we will talk some Michigan basketball in just a few minutes here as the Final Four is set to commence this week. One more bit of news, I should say, from the spring practice realm, and this is the stuff you don't like to report when you get these injuries in spring and you know how hard these guys are working, and then part of their season or all of it gets compromised. You love this guy's name, right? Tough Borland, the linebacker for Ohio State, an Achilles injury. We don't have all the details yet, but our Land of 10 Live reporting that he could miss up to the entire season. Obviously, Ohio State has a lot of depth there, but you never like to report on stories like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's really unfortunate because when you go through winter conditioning, all the lifting and the running, you go through these programs, you're getting your mindset ready for spring. And it's unfortunate because this was an opportunity for Tough Borland to really set the tone for that middle linebacker position, because I mean, he's a veteran guy. He's been in that system. I think a lot of his players probably looked towards him as being one of the leaders going into this year on the defense side of the ball. And it's really unfortunate because like you mentioned, you don't want to see kids injured before their careers even start. So a really tough break for Tough Borland. But again, like you point out to Sam, Ohio State has depth. They've got Justin Hilliard, who's a junior. They got the 5-star kid, Baron Browning, out of Texas. So again, Ohio State is never hurting for talent. You just hate to see for a kid like Tough Borland, who he's put in the work, put in the time to get that position. So, but he's a tough kid. You're not a tough kid when they name you Tough.
I knew something like that was coming. Leave it to the Michigan guy to come up with a play on words like that. I like it. Hey, speaking of words, what are you going to do? You can't win for losing. Now Justin chimes in, go Bucks. So viewer engagement, there you go, folks. Now I won't make the comment. I'd leave you the opportunity, if you want, as a Michigan guy, to talk about what that says about Ohio State fans and their verbosity, but we'll just leave it at that. How about if we do this instead? You excited for the madness of March? Well, you got an opportunity to make a boatload of money as well. One more weekend going on with the Final Four. Visit mybookie.ag. The madness of March is here, and you can make and win big betting on college hoops at mybookie.ag. Use the promo code LAND10, and they'll give you a 50% bonus with your first deposit. Go to mybookie.ag and start playing today. So, talking about Michigan and the Final Four, again, the other teams that want their comments or their names read about Big Ten basketball right now, keep playing. And Penn State, you don't count up there in Madison Square Garden. That's the NIT.
Should have been in. I'm just putting it out there.
If they were seeded better in the NIT, right? Go watch the tape on that, folks. You can see our debate on seeding in the NIT. But Michigan makes it to the Final Four. First of all, objectively, as the journalist you are, were you surprised to see Michigan in the game and the way that they've been able to escape against some not that necessarily highly regarded opponents, and they found their way into the Final Four nonetheless?
Well, I think you really have to look at how Michigan has been winning their games. You know, some games, you know, they're lights out from the three-point range, as Texas A&M found out. And some games they've had to rely on their defense. If you look at that Florida State game, Florida State has been averaging something like 88 points a game, and Michigan held this team to under 55 points. So Michigan has been able to win in a variety of ways, with their offense, with their defense. I'm not necessarily, I was surprised going into the tournament. I figured Michigan would probably get to the Elite Eight. The Final Four for me is just gravy on top of it. But, you know, a lot of teams, you know, a lot of highly ranked seeded teams were already knocked out. I figured Michigan would probably face North Carolina, would probably have to face Xavier, but those teams didn't make it. And I'll tell you one thing, you cannot sleep on teams that are higher seeded teams, because at this point, at this level, anybody can beat anybody.
So Michigan's played Montana, a 14 seed, Houston, a 6 seed. Then they get the game against Texas A&M, as you mentioned, a number 7 seed. And then they play the 9 seed in Florida State, and now they get an 11 seed, right, in Loyola Chicago. While meanwhile, on that other side of the bracket, you've got 2 number 1 seeds that make it to the Final Four. What about those guys out there? They're going to say, well, Michigan, they had an easy road. Look at the road that Villanova's had to go down, or the road that Kansas has had to go down.
Well, listen. You can only play the teams that are in front of you. It's not our fault. It's not Michigan's fault that North Carolina.
Well, this is objective journalists. It's not our fault.
It's not Michigan's fault that North Carolina wasn't able to beat the team that was in front of them. It's not Michigan's fault that Xavier was not able to beat the team in front of you. You can only play what's in front of you, and if it's an easier path, it is what it is. But again, when you get to this level of basketball in this tournament, anyone can beat anyone at this level. And if you look at Loyola Chicago, a lot of those guys are transfers in. They play really well together. They got a similar system to what Michigan runs. So I mean, it's going to be it should be a really good game, because these teams are identical. I think the only advantage really is between Xavier Simpson and what Mo Wagner brings to the table. Mo Wagner matched up with their center should be a mismatch that Michigan should be able to exploit. But Loyola is coached really well, and I expect them to adjust. So it should be a good game. But as far as Michigan have an easier path, listen, you can only play the teams that are in front of you, and Michigan is in the Final Four.
Speaking of coaching, and we've talked about on this show Matt Painter, we've lauded him, and John Beilein before too. Would you say right now, if you were starting a new team in the Big Ten, would you pick John Beilein to be your head coach, or do you still look at the track record of a guy like Tom Izzo and you say, well, maybe, you know, with the national championship that he's won, that he would take that nod?
Well, listen, I mean, Tom Izzo's track record of late has not been great, especially against John Beilein. So if you go back, and there's a lot to critique in that game, the Michigan State game versus Syracuse, and Michigan State fans will probably say the same, that they don't believe that was one of Tom Izzo's best coach games, and I think he deserves all the criticism for that. So, but if I'm a 5-star athlete kid and I'm looking to be developed, I'm definitely going to look at coaches like Beilein. I'm definitely going to look at coaches like Matt Painter. I'm definitely going to look at those guys who have a track record of not just developing top tier talent, but developing guys that are 2 stars, 3 stars, under the radar guys. Those are the coaches that I'm going to look at, because I want to be developed as an athlete.
But how about this in that vein, though? If you're a 2 or 3-star guy, I mean, look at a guy like Muhammad Ali Abdur-Rahman and the praise that Beilein had for him after the Texas A&M game. That is a guy who was not highly regarded coming out of high school, that's become a great college player and has been coached up and his skill set's improved. And Mo Wagner the same way. But if I'm a 5-star kid and I want a path to the NBA, look at the success that Michigan State players have had, at least compared to Michigan in the NBA. If I'm a one and done type guy, maybe Tom Izzo's the coach that I want to play for.
Well, if you're you're looking at records, Michigan has put more first-round draft picks into the NBA than Tom Izzo has over the last few years. So that track record is now balancing itself out. And again, we're talking about developing those skills that you need to make it at the next level. And sometimes, listen, some guys, when they get to the NBA, their careers don't always take off instantly. Sometimes they need a little bit more seasoning. They need a little bit more development, and then their careers kind of take off, as you see with Trey Burke. His career has been kind of resurrected, so to speak. So again, it depends on what you're looking for. If you're a one and done guy, then Michigan probably is not going to be the best path for you. Michigan State, Duke, all these other schools that are kind of known for that, that's probably going to be the best path for you. But if you're looking to be developed as a player, I don't think there's any other coach better in the Big Ten than either Tom Izzo, Matt Painter, and those two guys.
He's bringing it, man. I mean, this is objective information. He's not just wearing his maize and blue right now. He's got fire. He's spitting it out. That was some serious analysis. Let's take a break for a second. We know Sister Jean has been kind of sweeping the nation at Loyola, and her being a fan of the Ramblers, and now Jalen Rose's grandmother. I didn't realize this until I saw the clip. She's 100 years old. Take a look at this. She looks pretty good for 100, right? Look at this.
Jean, it's been a good ride, but it's over Saturday. Go Blue, 100.
I like it. That's good. I like it. Not bad. Jalen Rose's grandmother. We were talking before the show. I mean, Jalen gets his looks from his grandma, does he not? I mean, they got similar facial structure.
Yeah, they look just alike.
It's all right there. From insult to injury, or how does that segue go? I don't know. One of the reasons that I think Purdue's season was derailed was Isaac Haas and the injury that he suffered in that first round game. They're able to make it through to the end. They run out of offense against Texas Tech, and then Texas Tech had the same experience against Villanova, and now we get the news that Isaac Haas will go ahead and have surgery on that arm. Those engineers at Purdue were working on it, man. I mean, they finally got something NCAA approved, but it never worked out. You feel bad for a kid like that, right? A four-year kid who worked really hard with a bunch of his classmates. Purdue loses a ton off this year's team. Yeah. We'll talk more about that in a second, but he doesn't get the opportunity to go through the entirety of their experience in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, really unfortunate. Really unfortunate for a guy like Isaac Haas. Like you mentioned, he really put in the work, really got himself into outstanding shape, and was, you know, one of the premier big men in our conference. And it's just really unfortunate. He did have the surgery. He tweeted out earlier that the surgery went great. I think he'll probably be out 2 to 3 months, so he'll probably miss the NBA Combine, but he should be back in time enough to probably go through some camps to work out with some teams later on. But really unfortunate for him. But again, this is a sport that we play. But Isaac Haas, he'll be back. He'll be better, and I think he'll be a high draft pick.
How much does Isaac Haas look like Drago? I mean, come on, man. Right?
It is stunningly. Their comparison, the jawline. That's what it is. It's the jawline.
The jawline and the hair color. I think that's what it is. One more serious comment, and then one off the field news. The notion of Michigan in the Final Four and the potential, obviously they're favored against Loyola, and they'd probably be underdogs whoever they played if they were still playing on Monday for the national championship. And don't worry, I'm going to make you've weaseled on some of these predictions, but we'll get that out of you before the end of the show. What does it mean for the Big Ten that Michigan is able to get to the Final Four and maybe beyond in a year that the Big Ten only gets 4 tournament teams in? They don't get a lot of credit for their non-conference scheduling. Did Michigan kind of save or bail out the Big Ten in a sense this year?
Well, listen, I think if you're a fan of of really solid basketball, you have to be a fan of the Big Ten, because we play some really solid basketball in this league. Not a whole lot of highlight dunks, not a lot of flash, but they play really sound basketball. I think going into the season, I don't think a lot was expected of the Big Ten, especially when you had teams like Iowa and Wisconsin who are just prominent fixtures come tournament time. They weren't there, and they weren't really good. So I think a lot of people look down on the Big Ten in the schedule because those teams has suffered so much. So, but I think it's a good look for the Big Ten to have Michigan in representing in the Final Four. I'm pretty sure it's probably taking on the same approach when you look at bowl games. Everyone kind of roots for, if you're in the Big Ten, you're supposed to root for Big Ten schools, but I don't think that's the case. I think Michigan is all alone in that regard.
There's kind of an irony in this, right? That the Big Ten won every bowl game except for Michigan's loss, and now Michigan's the last basketball team playing in the NCAA tournament.
That's a good pickup.
Hey, man, I'm here every once in a while. I don't have the objective journalism that you got. I'm just
trying
to scroll, finding a nut or whatever that thing is. Two more notes before we keep it moving on Big Ten and some more things going on the gridiron. A couple guys have already declared for the NBA draft. Keita Bates-Diop going to leave Ohio State. Probably not a surprise. The Conference Player of the Year. It's my understanding, I think, that he is into the draft, signed with an agent, and that's it. Whereas Carson Edwards for Purdue has not yet signed with an agent. I think you have until June 11th to make that decision if you're going to stay in. And maybe that's a little bit more of a surprise, but almost the whole team was leaving at Purdue. They had that really acclaimed senior class. They're all gone. What do you make of those two decisions?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think for Diop, it makes sense because, the guy put up unbelievable numbers, player, national player in our conference. So I think it makes sense for him. Obviously, when you're talking about with Carson Edwards, I think he's just testing the waters, and I think that's obvious, especially since he didn't sign with an agent. But I think for Carson Edwards, you look at what the numbers statistically that he had from his freshman year. I think he was averaging like maybe a little under 10 points a game to now he was averaging 18.5 points a game. A huge jump. He's a really good shooter, penetrates. He's very intelligent, high basketball IQ. So I think it makes sense for him to kind of test the waters and see where he falls. He get an opportunity to work out in front of scouts, and if it doesn't work out, he can still come back to school and play another year.
Which is what Mo Wagner did at Michigan last year, that he put his name in the draft, got the evaluation, found out that he wasn't going to be as high of a pick or not satisfactory to him, and then he decided to come back to school, and it's all worked out for him. It was great to watch the interview that he gave at the end of the game when they did advance to the Final Four, talking about his dad coming to see him and the decision to come back. That was a pretty cool story. A couple cool storylines like that for the Michigan team. Rockbond we already talked about, and then Mo Wagner. Let's talk some football here, but want to remind you that you're watching Land of 10 live right here on our Land of 10 Facebook page. For all of the news, insight, and expert analysis about all things Big Ten, join us every week, 6 o'clock Eastern, 5 o'clock Central, or on demand anytime. We talked about Penn State a second ago and the replacement of Saquon Barkley, and maybe the traditional storyline for spring practice, right, is when you get a position battle and a quarterback battle. That's what everybody likes to talk about going into the spring, and those of them that are still unresolved by fall camp. And as we said last week, you got these going on at both Ohio State and Michigan's practice getting underway, and we'll see still if there's going to be a ruling on Shea Patterson. What's that mean for your team if you've got a quarterback position battle going on in the spring? Is that something that's a negative influence or a distraction, or is it just part of the business? Well,
for any coach, you want to go into, you would love to go into spring knowing who your quarterback is. But unfortunately, you have guys who graduate, they leave the program, or they transfer the program. So you're always kind of left trying to figure out who's going to be the guy that's going to step up. And I think that's the situation that you find yourself in at Michigan. But at Ohio State, you have a guy like J.T. Barrett, who seems like he'd been there for 10 years, setting all kind of records, and he finally graduates. But now you've got to find out, how do you replace that kind of production? And for Ohio State, they recruited the position really well. Obviously, Dwayne Haskins Jr., he came in last year to relieve J.T. Barrett against Michigan, did an outstanding job. But they also have Tate Martell, who's there. They also have the other quarterback, cannot think of his name, Joe Burrow, who's still there, so he's still competing. So, this is the opportunity for some of these guys to kind of separate themselves. Even though Dwayne Haskins was the first guy off the bench when J.T. Barrett got injured, doesn't mean he's necessarily going to be the starter, even though I figure him to have kind of the inside lane to be the starter in that position. But if you're at Michigan, you can't sit around and wait for whether or not Shea Patterson is going to be eligible or not. And I think Harbaugh put out today that there's still an opportunity for Wilton Speight to return the program. So that's another interesting thing. So it's not ideal if you're Michigan, because obviously that was probably one of the most uncertain positions going into to last season, and was one of the most crucial positions that really cost Michigan, kind of their season, if we're being honest. So not a position that you want to be in if you're Jim Harbaugh, but unfortunately it is what it is.
Stay on Wilton Speight for 1 second. I had some other things I wanted to get to, but I hadn't seen that yet, and I've read a ton of different things about Wilton Speight, and is it USC, or where is he going to go, and why did he leave? Is Michigan really going to take him back? Would that really happen? I mean, he decided to leave in part because he was not satisfied where the quarterback position or where his role was going, correct?
Yeah. Well, listen, I think it depends on his relationship with Jim Harbaugh. I mean, if you go back to the banquet after they had that 10-win season a couple years ago, Jim Harbaugh spoke very highly of Wilton Speight at the banquet. I mean, he talked highly of him. He talked about how great his parents were. He expected Wilton Speight to have an outstanding 2017 season, and unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. So I think it really depends on what kind of relationship Jim Harbaugh has with Wilton Speight. Does he trust him even if he decides to come back? Do you trust that player? But it will ultimately come down to his relationship with Wilton Speight.
That actually kind of makes an interesting segue to where I thought I wanted to go with this before you said that, which is this notion of the quarterback battle and what that does to the rest of the team. Let's take Michigan as an example. Let's say there were some guys that kind of felt like Wilton Speight with the injuries. Even a couple years ago, right at the Ohio State game, he was injured and he gutted that out to get them into overtime. They were, and then now these injuries that marred his 2017 season as well. What happens when your locker room has certain guys beside or behind one guy and then the other guy wins, and how do you keep control of that in your program?
Well, I mean, listen, it's not a difficult thing to do, because most of these guys have had to compete all their life to get to the positions of where they are. So if anyone in any program is expecting something to be handed to them, then that's not the guy for you. That's not who you want leading your team. You want a guy who's going to feel the pressure. You want a guy who's going to feel the competition and not shrink from it, but actually thrive in that competition. And I think that's kind of what Jim Harbaugh wants to do. He wants to create a very competitive quarterback room, because iron sharpens iron, and when you're in that quarterback room, you're looking at the guy next to you like, hey, I'm here. Like, I'm going to fight for this position, and that's what you want. You don't want guys in there that think that something's just going to be handed to them.
Try to think back over your playing days. Obviously, the most controversial quarterback battle maybe ever at Michigan was Brady and Henson, which was after you were gone. We know that you overlapped with Tom Brady, and you shared that story with folks, and they can check it out at Atlanta 10 Live. I'm trying to think back the early part of your career. There were a couple times that the job was up for grabs before Brian Griese claimed it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We had Scott Driesbach, who was our quarterback. Of course, Tom Brady was kind of in the mix, but we had recruited really well at the quarterback position. So, but for a guy like Griese, who was a fifth-year guy who didn't know if he wanted to come back or not, because he saw all the quarterbacks that Michigan had recruited. These guys were young, they were hungry, but he decided not to shrink in the face of adversity. He came back, he fought for the position, and he actually won the position based off of how much effort he had put into in the offseason.
Good stuff. A couple more moments here on Atlanta 10 Live. Want to get to this one on Wisconsin as we kind of look at some of the storylines, getting us set for spring football. How good is this offensive line that they got that Jonathan Taylor runs behind? Is this the best offensive line to look forward to in the Big Ten this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Wisconsin has just always been, they're to me, their offensive line, their O-line, they've always been outstanding at running the ball. They've always been outstanding at putting offensive linemen into the NFL. Look at the production that they've had. Look at the running backs that they put into the league because of the offensive line production that they've had. Wisconsin is just, when it comes to playing smash mouth football, is one of the best teams in the Big Ten at doing that. And when you can get a guy like a Jonathan Taylor, who was, again, another under the radar recruit who was actually committed to Rutgers before he decommitted and committed to Wisconsin, when you can get a kid like that and running behind an offensive line like Wisconsin's offensive line, nothing but good things can happen.
Well, some good stuff happened on this show. I want to nail you down on what kind of good stuff the Michigan basketball team might have in store, but I'll remind folks that we got more of these spring football questions coming up next week. And I got this thing here, they call it a laptop. I can use it on my lap or this table. If you guys have questions that you want answered about spring competitions going on around the Big Ten or just previews on some of these teams, we're open-ended right now. We'll have plenty more features coming up over the course of the summer. All right, I bought you some time to think about it.
I'm ready.
I guess the way I let you off the hook last time was I said, was Michigan the most likely team to still be playing out of the Big Ten this week? But I can't ask it that way anymore. There's only one Big Ten team left.
Yeah.
You don't like to put yourself in this position. I mean, what do I ask you? How many more games is Michigan going to win this year? Is that disguised enough? I mean, what?
Well, listen. This is how confident I was.
Oh,
I am now.
Okay.
I am now. I wore my Michigan Jordan shoes to taping today. I wore my Michigan raincoat today. I believe Michigan will win a national championship.
Oh, you heard it here. Drop the pen moment.
I'm just saying.
Can we get a shot of those shoes? Are you flexible
I don't know.
enough?
I'm not flexible enough. Yeah, I'd tear something. I'd tear something if I try to kick it up there.
We better go before I make him do that. Thanks to all you guys for tuning in. As Chris would tell you, go blue this weekend. We'll be back to report on it next week. Thanks for joining us. For Chris, I'm Sam. It's been Atlanta 10 Live.